goes back to the respect for the unconscious. Like, something that excites me in writing is like having some respect too for the unknowability of myself and other people. If I surprise myself, like when you're reading back those lines from earlier writing, I'm like, I didn't know that I wrote that.
Hey, welcome to the Art Project Podcast. We're talking with artists about their current projects and their past works and everything in between. This is your host, Camila Moreiras. So just to get started with a little bio, Melanie Jane Parker is a writer, a student of yoga and Buddhism, and a full-time caregiver based in Brooklyn, New York. She has been a contributing writer for The Gothamist, a research assistant for Arian Cohen and Fountain House, a transcriber, copywriter, proofreader, and copy editor for the likes of HBO, 10-1, The Paris Review, Penn, and you've also worked for the literary journal A Public Space. You have a Substack under the moniker Text Message, where you post stories, essays, and ruminations about once a month. So, Melanie, thanks for joining. It's really, really good to have you here.
Thanks for having me. This is really exciting.
Can you start by saying how you manage all of this?
Well, when I first moved to Brooklyn, I was a nanny and I was a lead copy editor for a national conscious culture magazine. And I was an intern at Gothamist and at A Public Space. Then I dovetailed out of nannying. So there's always been some overlap and some, I guess you could say, like integrative juggling, a lot of juggling of different roles across different fields. I don't think you mentioned in the introduction that I wrote for Flaunt for some time, but Flaunt magazine is a publication that I started writing for in 2011 or 2012. Being commissioned to write pieces for Flaunt was the way that I kept my writing practice alive during the period of time where I was teaching so intensively. And I actually was able to generate like surprising, exciting prose.
I mean, I think it also just speaks to the varied interests that you have as a person, getting your hands involved in something new, but also complex and over time. Like, I feel like the way that you work is very built upon itself. In your short story, God's Hour, you write, she knows that if in her writing she alludes to pregnancy or birth or baby or motherhood, the story will inevitably be interpreted as autobiographical. So at the risk of adding to this sentiment, I want to know if you feel the same as your character. In other words, is this in fact an autobiographical sentence, or does this question spark a bit of frustration for you? We've talked in private before about the genre of domestic literature and the critiques getting lobbed at women writers being so drastically different than that of men writers, especially regarding like how they approach the minutia of domestic life or within domestic spaces. I'm thinking here of The Wall by Marlene Haushofer, even if that domestic space is a bit of an outlier versus Karl Ove Knausgaard, just as an example. But of course, there are countless others. So I wanted to ask, where do you see yourself in your writing within this context? And has it changed since becoming a mother?
I feel maybe more curiosity around what we experience as readers in relationship to the idea of the writer. That story and lines like the one you read felt like a form of play for me and a kind of experimentation with what is true and what is a lie that is necessary in order to access or point toward a truth. So that sentence is both autobiographical and not. Like, I can feel that way, but it can also belong to the narrator, a narrator who isn't me. And I love this question about domestic literature. I think it has something to do with my really keen interest in Buddhism and maybe specifically Zen Buddhism. There's so much attention given to the mundane and the boring. And there's all of this language and all of these practices around becoming more aware of how the mundane and the boring does make up the stuff of our lives.
Right.
Like that's pretty much it. Like 98% of our lives, it comes down to doing laundry and walking the dog. But maybe because of this influence, I read a lot of Buddhist literature and I listen to a lot of Dharma talks, and I think the form of the Dharma talk has really influenced my writing as well, especially over the last 5 or 6 years. There's something that I find reliable and continually inspiring, for lack of a better word. I don't know, like origami comes to mind, where like on one side you have the seemingly everyday, like the minutia, but then on the other side, which when you really look at it is not separate from the side of the mundane, there's everything. There's like transcendent experience, there's the divine, there's the cosmic. So I tend to think in duality, I tend to think in binary terms, and working within the scope of domestic literature feels like a constant practice in trying to subvert that binary or that duality, that separation. Like, oh, they're actually just all part of the same piece of paper. And writing about, like what happens within the confines of a home is no less interesting or important than writing about a great adventure into, like an unfamiliar place.
I feel like what's definitely true is that even within these small spaces, these kind of slices of life or the minutia of the everyday, is that you do stick to the relational. The stories that I've read of yours, I want to say, are mostly with at least two people. Usually conversations between them or like a thought between one towards the other. But these people are mostly adults. And with this, it seems to me that there is often some level of stuckness with what they're able to give emotionally. And here I'm just going to pull a quote from your story, Soft Opening. 81 of the 85 parking spots were unoccupied. He watched as she draped a sun visor over the dashboard. She noticed him watching her. Overwhelmed with vague embarrassment, she considered folding up the visor and putting it back in the trunk, but could not tolerate the thought of him seeing her hands continue to perform indecisive gestures. She wished he would turn away. He turned away. He sighed at the ground. He grimaced at the sky. "Why do you always look so angry?" she wanted to ask. Instead, she said, "This is just their soft opening, so they'll be really trying their best." There's something in these lines to me that is just so sad. There's so much that's left unsaid. And I've always been drawn to this question of the unsayable precisely because everything that is said. And that to me is like sort of the origami that you're referring to. It's everything that is left unsaid on one side is everything that is said on the other. But that unsaying carries not only a deep history, but also a deep future. A lot of it is maybe a projection into the unknown of the future that creates so much dread. And so we kind of clam up. And I feel like that clamming up is so prevalent in a lot of your characters. So what is your process? I mean, you mentioned your interest in Zen Buddhism. You've mentioned your interest in very disparate topics, your experience with teaching and even drawing like syllabi and class preparations as a form of creative writing. But what's your process for investigating the inner world of your protagonists? And why do you think that you're drawn to this stuckness? I know that you do have a love of psychoanalysis. I imagine that figures into this, but if you could just elaborate on that.
I love that you use the word unsayable because I agree with you. I think this goes back to my collegiate engagement with psychoanalysis and with the work of Annie Rogers. I was reflecting on this question in preparation for our conversation, and I was remembering when I was younger and I would watch movies or read books, and there would be, a scene between characters where, as the viewer, as the reader, I have all this information about what's at play for everyone involved. And I know what's not being said, and I think I know what needs to be said in order to shake things up or instigate a change or bring about some transformation in relationship. And I used to get so frustrated and sort of indignant about, like, why aren't they just saying it? Like, this is what needs to be said. And this person knows what they want to say. And this other person probably knows what they need to hear, but it's not happening. And I remember feeling a little like self-righteous about it. Like, if I were in that position, I would make a different decision. I would be brave. I would say that thing. That was even true when I was studying psychoanalysis, and after I graduated from Hampshire and was, then kind of returned to the reading of psychoanalysis as personal enjoyment and not necessarily for an academic purpose. But I think there's this really essential misunderstanding in my study of psychoanalysis where I developed this belief that, like, if everything could just be said, if everything could just be uncovered and brought into awareness, then everyone would have a chance at real communication, real healing, real understanding. And now I'm like, I understand why people don't say what they need to say. I understand why there's so much more silence and avoidance and turning away and deciding to make a remark about the mundane rather than go to the heart of what's between two people.
I think that in speaking towards somebody, the conversation is already taking place before the meat of what you're trying to say is there, right? It's an invitation to also receive some kind of response from the other person. So even in that situation that you were talking about of like watching a movie and being frustrated with it, in real life, you could say the thing, but it would get misinterpreted, or you would actually be saying what you thought the other person was expecting you to say or thought that they needed to hear, but in fact, that wasn't it at all.
Yeah, I think that I've gained a respect for the unconscious. Like, it has its reasons. There are things that cannot be brought into language. And I believe that the struggle to give form to the unsayable can take on some real artistic shape and volume and value. But I do have more respect now for what isn't sayable, for what isn't expressible.
Is it worth trying to verbalize these things? I mean, I even think going back to the minutia of life, there's so much repetition, and part of progress in one's life, of literally just progressing from moment to moment, is becoming okay with repetition. And so it's like, even with your characters, they're of course different characters. There's nothing inherently repetitive about it. But maybe there is something that brings them together, and that is that stuckness, so that there is a kind of repetition, not only of your characters, but in your writing process of, even if it's trying to get closer to, like, how do you write about what cannot be said? And I'm always thinking about the photographer Sally Mann. And in her memoir, she has this quote that I'll just paraphrase, where she says something to the degree of, her main desire is to photograph air. So it's like, of course, she has these photographs of her kids and her family and the southern landscape. And I mean, her body of work is immense and beautiful. But it also goes beyond what is visible to the human eye, and it's everything that's around it. So I see a kind of parallel between this, but it seems to me that repetition in trying to say something that cannot be said through writing, especially if we go back to the autobiographical, which is both not and is at the same time, there is a duality that's kind of always at play here for you, I think.
Well, it's stunning to hear you say all of that, because it reminds me that, to go back to Hampshire again, when I was playing around with different thesis project ideas, I at first proposed a paper about Amy Hempel's very short fiction. And I'm trying to remember exactly more or less what I wanted to do. I wanted to write about what was not being said. Every time I read her work and read her work, what I imagine is that there were many, many more words, and she ruthlessly pruned until, she had this super succinct but extremely evocative paragraph. And what I wanted to get into was everything that she had left out. But I agree with you. I think this repetition and this looking at the same situations from different angles, that is very fundamental to how I think about stories. And it also is relevant to what you asked about, is it worth trying? When a singular experience is maybe impossible to approach head on, it makes more sense to me to get at it obtusely. What feels unsayable, impossible to describe, I might just try a sentence in a piece that is not overall about that thing, but maybe there's a way that I can look at it fleetingly.
A meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's a good place to talk about your commission pieces. And as you said, because that was a question that I had, is if you tended to pitch the ideas or if they were like on assignment for you. But either way, I imagine that these pieces they're not written for you or for your, let's say, first imagined audience. These are for an audience through Flaunt magazine. And you really do span quite a lot of topics with Flaunt. You have written on the friendships between Coco Chanel and Misia Cert, art criticism pieces on installations at PS1, and an essay you call In the New America, a trippy essay on U.S. healthcare, political doublespeak, and more, which is a great title. But the way that you put pen to paper on these topics still feels like there is this thread of intimacy. And I guess I mean that in different ways, like intimacy through the friendship, let's say, of Coco and Misia, but also an intimacy in the sense of your proximity to the pieces. To me, it seems like you're fully present in them. You embed yourself into their landscape in a way that is at once personal and expansive. And so to bring up Amy Hempel again, there is an interview that Vice magazine does with her. And she talks about an interview that she read with Joan Didion. And here she's speaking on the satisfaction of writing fiction versus nonfiction. Whereas I suppose the satisfaction that she gleaned from writing fiction, it was in that discovery maybe, or that pruning. But with nonfiction, her satisfaction came from the research, because that was the first encounter with what she was developing, whereas like writing that down was kind of a second act. I wanted to pull directly from the essay because I think that this is connected. In this essay, in the New America, you are talking about a psychiatrist who's interviewing the Dalai Lama, who, as you note, is in the business of the dialectic. He knows about repetition. And then you continue, if you sift through Buddhist literature, you find heaps of frustration, many students wanting to know the answer, and many teachers not giving it, or at least not giving it in the way the student wants to hear. So the teacher says it again in an attempt to catch the student in the liminal space between desiring and receiving, so that perhaps the student hears it anew. Which I just think is such a beautiful way to think about this space that is potentially encompassed within this dialectic. What is this space between desiring and receiving for you? And I'd say that this connects with a line that you have in your essay on friendships, where you write, her willingness to become and become and become and become was her protection. So there's this safeguarding, which could also be desiring or receiving, really, depending on how you look at it.
Your questions are doing what I would like to be doing in my writing all the time, which is bringing many different threads together, and it all makes sense. And the picture that those threads form is showing me something that I didn't see. And when you said threads of intimacy, I heard threats of intimacy. Like the threat of intimacy, that feels true too. Like I was saying, the beauty of writing for Flaunt, they've given me a lot of opportunities to play around with different voices, and they've never asked me to define what it is that I'm giving them. So there are a handful of pieces that might appear to be nonfiction, but they're fiction, right? Might appear to be essay, but they're short stories. There's a lot of satire in there. There's some science fiction or dystopian fiction. So I'm very grateful for the permission to dabble and to learn how much I enjoy writing across this array of genre. And the story I wrote about Jenny Sabin's work, I'm forgetting what her title is, but something like an experimental architect and designer. She had a big installation at PS1, and I had the honor of interviewing her and then transcribing the interview and then turning that into the feature. And a lot of my paid work has been transcription of interviews. And so the form of the interview has always been integral to how I think about storytelling in any way. I love transcribing because I love listening to people talk to each other. And like, and the threat of intimacy in some interviews is really potent. And I love the interview form. Yeah, I love eavesdropping. I love overhearing conversations and people who aren't speaking for me. Like I'm not the intended listener. Because, when you're in conversation with someone, there is only really one way you can hear it. You're anticipating what you're going to say, or you're thinking about it's so much more weighted and fraught, I think.
So would you say that eavesdropping allows you to listen more fully?
Yeah, I think I can like relax back and take it in like surround sound and hear both parties or all parties relatively equally. It's like what Freud described. He said the analyst has to make their whole body an organ of listening, evenly suspended attention. The thought of that to me is just so ideal. It's like, I wish I could bring that to every interaction, like evenly suspended attention, making my whole body an organ of listening. And of course I can. And so to be in the position of like the pure listener who is not expected to respond is a very interesting position for me. So I love transcribing. I used to spend a lot of time working in cafes and would often get distracted by actual eavesdropping. To go back to your inquiry about the space between desiring and receiving, like, I think that when I can see or hear that space opening up for other people or between other people, that's very exciting to me. Both in psychoanalytic theory and in Buddhist philosophy, there's a lot of discussion about what it means to want something, about desire, and then what it means to get what you want or get what you think you want, what you thought you wanted, or to get what you didn't know you wanted, or to get what you didn't want, right? Like there are all of these permutations that come off of desire, and inevitably it leads to just more complications. Like there's never a hermetically sealed relationship between wanting something and getting it. There's always a lot more than you bargained for. And that's often completely entangled with repetition, right? Like what we tend to desire resembles everything else that we desire.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about this recently of like, what is want? What is desire? Because they're obviously, like everything, they're terms that we can talk about at the level of the unconscious or the level of consciousness or what's brought into focus for us. But I think that there are many moments where we start to question our own repetition being not an iteration of everything else that we want, but an asking of like, did I ever want this to begin with? And that it's like a breakdown of those two spaces. So I don't know if that necessarily falls in the in between or if you have to, but you know, maybe there's something to that you have to voice it in order to know if you did want that in the first place.
Yeah, I think that the excerpt that you read aloud from Soft Opening too, there's the wanting to say something and saying something else. And then you also mentioned the line from the piece that mentions the Dalai Lama, the dialectic, repetition, and examples of teachers in Buddhist literature surprising a student, like withholding what they think the student wants and or throwing something at the student that they aren't anticipating, trying to catch them in a moment of wanting something, getting something else. And it's like the space between what is wanted and what is received, where they actually apprehend or comprehend. I think that frustration, the frustration that arises within someone or between people, is something that keeps prose really energetic for me, whether I'm reading it or writing it. And there are opportunities for surprise when there's, I would say, like a subtle tension or a subtle frustration. Well, I was thinking about how, like, the majority of our experience happens internally. Like, most of what happens in a relationship is actually happening within the individuals involved. And that between space is its own thing, but it's not really reflective of the totality of what's happening for each person. And I think that that's sort of like the domestic literature question. If we look at a whole life, most of that life is spent doing things that we wouldn't put in an obituary. Like, this person spent this much time taking their car to the mechanic, or like this much time weeding in the garden. It's similar, I think, with the nature of a relationship. It's like most of what's happening, what's known, what's shared or spoken in the relationship, that's such a small percentage of what that relationship is actually constituted by, which is like unspoken internal experience and the frustration that entails, the unknowability of one person to another. And it goes back to the respect for the unconscious. Like, something that excites me in writing is having some respect too for the unknowability of myself and other people. So if I surprise myself, like when you're reading back those lines from earlier writing, I'm like, I didn't know that I wrote that. Like you asked in the questions that you shared in advance of this, you asked about how I chose my subjects for the essay on friendships. I don't remember. Whatever, like those old essays, they contain the digested, synthesized research that I was doing for that essay, which meant I was reading a lot of different things from different sources. And I don't remember what all of that was, but it became that piece. And when I look back at that old writing, if I still feel connected to it, I feel surprised by it. When I look back at old writing and I feel embarrassed by it or disappointed with it, I think it's usually because I can see what's coming. I'm like, oh, then I'm going to say this.
So it's the surprise, feeling like the encounter is a new encounter, which is what you like.
Yeah, and not actually reading myself. That is a feeling that I don't take for granted. Yeah.
Right. Well, maybe that is what desire actually is that surprise in a good way of that encounter, of something that you maybe didn't remember you were feeling, in the context of that. But in writing, it would be maybe that you didn't remember that what you wrote. I don't know why that all just reminded me of, like, I think that the grocery store is one of the most intimate spaces because it's where you can be totally anonymous. Every now and again, you run into someone that you know. And then there seems to be this shyness that comes of, like, don't look at what food I've chosen to put in my cart. It's like a peek into someone's bathroom, it's something that's very primal, very out in the open, but at the same time, incredibly intimate, which is actually, I think, sums up your writing really well. Your writing is a grocery store.
It's a grocery store.
Well, this can't be called the Art Project Podcast without also asking about what is next on the table for you.
Well, I think just keeping up with the Substack, I became a parent and my life has gotten much simpler and much quieter, and my radius of excursion, shrunk dramatically. So I noticed at some point that I was texting profusely, like entire essays to people. And I was clearly trying to work out some ideas in these text messages without authorization, without invitation. I could sort of feel like around when my son turned 1, I could feel this creative urgency coming up again. Like, oh, I want to recommit to my writing practice, and having all this distance. I'm not on social media anymore. Having distance from the world of online commentary and text proliferation, and even having some space from constant exposure to cultural materials made me feel a little safer about returning to my own creative practice. I'm very easily influenced and I'm very easily discouraged. And I've always had a lot of self-doubt around my writing and whether it's worth my time or my effort. And there's just something about the circumstances of my life now that make me feel like I can ignore some of what I was listening to in myself, but I can also ignore some of the chatter from outside. So, in order maybe to provide some relief to the people I was texting all the time, I decided to actually write in a formal way. And that's been wonderful. The discipline of writing something every month feels at once manageable and like a reasonable challenge. So just continuing with that. And I've also been thinking recently about doing some audio, like soundscape field recording work, which I used to do a lot of when I lived on the West Coast. And then when I first moved to Brooklyn, I would just record kind of randomly environmental sounds. Sometimes I would do, I don't know if you would call it performance art, but I would kind of manipulate sounds in the environment or say things. Because I spend all of my time with my child, there's a lot, I think, happening on the sonic level that I would like to capture. And for me, that's not so distant from writing. As I said, like, I love listening, and I feel moved to write not just when I've read something really strange or original or beautiful, but when I'm watching a film and the pacing of a certain scene or the dialogue or listening to music or taking a walk, all of that feeds into how I think about writing.
Thanks so much for coming on and talking with me about your work. We can't wait to keep on getting those monthly installments of your Substack text message. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. This has been really, really sweet, and I'm so excited about your podcast.